So I welcome you once again on behalf of Stanislav Marianovic, but he doesn't have to stand up once again. Our main author and host today, and of course myself. It seems almost impossible to talk about Marianovic, who is also one of the most excellent European graphic artists and the author of surrealist objects. Okay. Now, these are some of some of the examples of Marianovic's work. On the left side, you can see a surrealist object he made some 20 years ago, approximately, and it's of considerable size, I have to warn you. And on the right side, you can see his print work made in a very innovative technique, graphic technique, printing technique, which is called dry aquatint, which he innovated. Now, it's very hard to talk about him, only in the context of illustration, which he also deals with. He's multifunctional, of course. This is all the more true because Marianovic illustrations are originally linked to his own texts. In other words, that Stanislav Marianovic is a writer who illustrates his own words. This is one of the reasons I will start this presentation with one of my own seemingly unimportant remarks. In Marianovic's former study, there were several drawer units for archiving graphic prints. There were a small collection of objects on the tops of these units, and the collection was surrounded by Marianovic's paintings and various objects that were hanged on the walls. So you can see approximate illustration, a photograph which describes how did it look like. In the collections, there were fossils, minerals, shells, animal bones, weird skulls and bottles, unusual objects the artist brought from the Andes, recovered by diving from Aegean Sea, and of course, literally purchased in antique shops. All in all, Marianovic's study reminded me of the famous Dutch cabinets of curiosities. Now, what was Dutch cabinet of curiosity? Something like this one. Oh, yes. Now, cabinets of curiosities dating in 17th century. These were, from today's perspective, wondrous, fantastical, and perhaps entirely surreal home collections, which came into being as a consequence of colonial travels to the Far East. Creation of these cabinets of curiosities, but also of the famous Dutch still life paintings in the 17th century was based, among other things, on the trick of cognition. The trick was founded on the understanding how something very small in size, like a stone surface, insect, or a fossil, can become a source of wonder, and how a well-assembled group of such small things can become the enigma of the entire world. For that reason, one could often find precisely tiny objects in the Dutch cabinets of curiosity, just like small objects for everyday use were painted in still lifes of Dutch masters. However, these objects were described to immeasurable details, not rarely magnified, and in contact with other such objects brought to some sort of surreal identity exhibited in its own unrecognizability. Marianovic's body of artwork, and I truly believe that, is at least to some extent based on a very, very similar premise. To take what is genuine and small, seemingly irrelevant, and therefore sometimes invisible, to describe it in meticulous details, perhaps magnify it, and then make something else from it, or at least differently read. In this sense, it is sufficient to look at any illustration made by Marianovic, let us say the one depicting house monsters, which have made him globally famous, and understand that these seemingly fantastical and surreal characters possibly hide precise descriptions of the same natural forms as the ones exhibited on the tops of the raw units at the artist's former study. Why do I mention these facts? Namely, the idea of the miraculous is evident in all of Marianovich's artistic work, which can also be transferred to his work of illustrations, especially those illustrations that depict Marianovich's brand, that is monsters. Well, welcome Marianovich's monsters. These are some examples of the monsters. But in order to understand the idea of the monstrous in Marianovich's work, it's necessary to look into our cultural history. That is, to go a few centuries into the past and to consult nobody else but Christian Huygens. Do I have to mention that Huygens was also Dutch? Actually, Christian Huygens, famous Dutch scientist of the 17th century, was not only physicist, mathematician, and astronomer. Namely, in his final years, he indulged in some sort of speculative fiction. Therefore, in this context, he created a work titled Cosmotheos, or in the translation, The Beholder of the Cosmos. Now, that was the cover of his work. He published it, so the work was published in 1698, a few years after Huygens died. In this somewhat philosophical, partly scientific, and its in most part, interesting part, fictional writing, the scientist speculated how the inhabitants of other worlds might look like, among other things. He called them the planetarians. And in the context of these hypothetical beings, he wrote that, now the quote, "We must necessarily give them hands or some other member instead of hands, because without their help and assistance, man could never arrive to the improvement of their minds and natural knowledge. Shall we give them an elephant proboscis? This is true, because these beasts can perform such admirable feats, widgets, with proboscis, of course, that it has not very improperly been called their hand. Though indeed that is indeed nothing but a nose somewhat longer than ordinary. For this, a very ridiculous opinion that the common people have got among them, that is impossible for a rational soul to dwell in any other shape than ours. It would be a very pretty sight, pretty beyond all imagination, to see odd ways and the unusual manner of the planetarians, of course, setting about anything, and their strange method of living." At the end of his scientific career, Huygens obviously indulged in imagination, and in this process had a real fun by justifying possibilities that, for instance, the planetarians could have birds, bills, and feathers, or again, that the planetarians have their eyes and continents upright for the more convenient and easy contemplation and observation of the stars. Of course, Huygens relied here on the long European tradition of imagining wondrous phenomena which were assumed as existing, although no one knew for certain how they actually looked like. In the 20th century, the historian Jacques Le Goff contributed to this problem, or at least tried to explain our obsession with the miraculous. In his essay, last year. Now you're in the backstage, can you hear me? So I have to shout. Okay. What?
Okay, if you can speak this louder, then.
Yes, I can shout.
Yeah.
Don't worry, I can. So Le Goff talks about the marvelous, or mirabilia in Latin, as continuation, but also transformation of the earlier ancient tradition, and in terms of etymology. He places it the context of visuality. The marvelous is therefore, according to Le Goff, always related to visual metaphors and can logically be classified exactly by means of visually justified terms. Le Goff suggests that, by the way, now these are some examples of the medieval miraculous, medieval monsters as an example of miraculous. The marvelous is therefore, according to the historians, always related to visual metaphors and can logically be classified exactly by means of visually justified terms. Le Goff suggests the following classification of the marvelous phenomenon. Lands and places, to start with, meaning natural places or made by man. Human and anthropomorphic beings like giants, dwarves, fairies, humans with special corporeal features. But then again, human monsters, animals, natural or imaginary. Threanthropes, or half humans, half animals, like sirens or, for example, the werewolves. Objects, to end with, objects and historical figures who became sources of the marvelous. Finally, when he talks about functions of the medieval marvelous, the writer mentions the following. Number one, compensation, anti-humanism, and finally, the fulfillment. Fulfillment in this case means that something is against the idea of the man in the image of God. And fulfillment is also more than pleasure. The real aim, says Le Goff, is the marvelous as more comprehensive investigation of universal reality. I recalled Christian Huygens and the planetarians, but also Jacques Le Goff and his research on medieval imagination, faced with a considerable opus of original writings and illustrations signed by Stanislav Marjanovic. These are texts and illustrations dedicated exactly to the phenomenon of the marvelous. In terms of genre, they belong to fantasy literature, intended in principle for younger audience. However, most titles are dedicated to the phenomenon of monsters. Starting in 1997, Stanislav Marjanovic wrote and illustrated 14 original books and picture books. In total, they were published in 23 countries, which not only secured a global audience, but also a number of Croatian as well as international awards. Furthermore, Marjanovic illustrated another two picture books written by Nada Horvat. I'm not going to mention them. But if we talk exclusively about picture books written and illustrated by Stanislav Marjanovic, now you see the covers on the slide. Titles are the following. House Monsters number 1, 1997. The Book of Magic Formulas, 1999. House Monsters 2, 2000. Animals Like You and Me, but that was after Jean de La Fontaine, in 2001. The Lost Slippers, 2004. The Encyclopedia of Monsters, 2008. Then the Encyclopedia of Humans, A Real Monster Breaks His Silence, 2009. Oh, yes. Then the monsters in the museum, 2010. House Monsters number 3, 2010 again. Benevolent Monsters of Croatia, number 1, 2012. Benevolent Monsters of Croatia 2, 2013. We've got a lot of them here. Fish Shredder and Other Mysterious Words, 2015. The Necklace, All Made of Our Faces, 2018. And finally, How to Live with House Monsters, Illustrated Handbook for Children and Adults, 2020. Now, these are just some of the possible colors that you can see here, but all the others probably are on the desk. The monsters are therefore, culturally speaking, legitimate and even one of the essential parts of the phenomenon of the marvelous, and their existence derives most probably from the ancient idea of the antipodal, in the words that are antipodal or opposite to this one. So, antipodal world is the opposite to our own. Creatures live that are equally opposite to us. Analogously, the same idea is pursued by Huygens, except for the fact that he places the opposite worlds and their marvelously imagined inhabitants to other planets. But Marianovic uses inversion to locate his monsters in spaces that are much closer to us, to our homes. Indeed, already in his early titles, like the Picturebook House Monsters number 1, or the Book of Magic Formulas, Marianovic, and these two titles, so on the left side, House Monsters number 1, Book of Magic Formulas on the right side, Marianovic planted his marvelous, hilarious, and above all benevolent, monstrous creatures in parallel, but actually antipodal realities of our homes. Yes, our homes. In the cellars and other hidden places of our homes. They reside there unnoticed, and you, says the author, I quote, do not know absolutely anything about them. And how would you know? Although they do meddle in our business and follow us closely, less is written about them than about, for example, zebra stripes or frog's heads. Then Marianovic starts to list and describes one monster after another, and in the handbook, and this is the first key feature of his narration. Immediately after that, he uses his second narrative peculiarity, and this is developing a number of smaller stories related to each individual monster. For instance, well, let's meet the one of them. Let us meet the one of these monsters. Now his name is, in Croatian, Narciso Krivozor, or in English translation, which is, I have to say, approximate, very approximative one, Narcissi the wrong side. Narcissi the wrong side. Describing a creature called Narcissi the wrong side, the writer gives an introductory explanation. By using enchanted, decisive mirrors, Narcissi the wrong side is amusing himself by hiding from us our true image. And then tells the following. And so, he once succeeded in convincing a lady who looked pretty much like an elephant, that her ears were small and cute, and her nose short and delightful. Believing him, she tried to put on a very tight skirt by pulling it over her head. Luckily, the skirt ripped, and her cute, enormous ears and delightful proboscis remained intact. Marjanović continues in more or less the same tone when writing about other monstrous creatures. Descriptions, serial listings, and opening up of smaller narratives within a broader narrative course are Marjanović's fundamental narrative strategies. However, he does not hesitate to use their variations. In the same manner he lists and narrates in the form of prose, he also describes, lists, and narrates in the form of poetry. Another instance in his book, The Necklace All Made of Our Faces, designed seemingly as poetry, moreover, a dodecasyllable in 4-line stanzas with coupled rhyme. In terms of narration, this text is based on the paraphrase of folk poetry. In other words, ornamental listing, connecting and comparing motifs of different characters and professions. A girl, Christina, is connected and compared to her brother to a cat, the cat to a dog, the dog to a postman, etc., etc., etc. It is interesting to notice 3 things here. First, the listing in this case is not open and infinite. In the end, the girl from the beginning returns to the girl from the very beginning, circularly and in terms of motif. Second, and again related to the development of tale within tale, each individual character or profession is defined by a rather short narration. A dog is chasing a postman. A postman is on the bicycle. The postman envies a tourist who is carelessly riding his new bicycle. The tourist falls down from a tree because he wanted to feed the crow. The crow recognized its own beak in the grandmother's nose, etc., etc., etc. The third observation refers to the content that accompanies motifs of some characters, namely the motif of the relationship, for example, between the apothecary and 2 single sisters, and even more, the relationship between the retired man who returned from abroad and the local priest are defined in former case as some sort of irony with erotic connotations, and in the latter case as even social criticism. Not at all coincidence. This places Marjanović's text unambiguously within semantic scope available for more adult reading audience. Exactly here, another and much broader problem emerges, and it refers to the entire literary body of work by Marjanović. The question of the profile of aimed audience, actually. Because if we can establish without any doubt that his earlier texts related mostly to the house monsters and intended for younger readers, the above described examples indicate the author's capability to incorporate not at all harmless content in seemingly harmless narrative forms. This observation especially refers to the 2 larger Marjanović writings, the Encyclopedia of Monsters, on the left side, the cover, and on the right side, you can see the Encyclopedia of Humans, The Real Monster Breaks His Silence. First one, 2008, and the second one, 2009. When she was writing her review for the Encyclopedia of Monsters, Professor Jadranka Damjanov, famous Croatian professor, already in her introduction observed exactly the multi-layered and hybrid qualities of this writing, which surpasses children age with the connotations it possesses. In the context of the same review, we find her 3 observations as even more interesting. The book of, now the quote, the book, the Encyclopedia of Monsters, is of different character. It is difficult to determine who is intended for. Picture books were without any doubt intended for children. Nevertheless, adults were able to enjoy in them too. This book, in this respect, is a hybrid, and the audience will probably be diverse. Author of the text and drawing is, of course, the same again. However, now the text prevails over drawings in terms of quantity. Therefore, the drawings become illustrations as befits a serious encyclopedia. Namely, the author undertakes probably a totally unique and original enterprise to overlay utterly bizarre content with objective encyclopedic scientific approach. This could result in some kind of naivety if it were not the author's irony, which is manifested in different ways and is of different intensities. First of all, the idea that is problematized already in the introduction says, among others, that encyclopedia is not written by human being, but exactly by monster, whose portrait is displayed immediately at the beginning of the book. The irony is most powerful in slight humor, manifested in the way the monster author is drawn as well as other monsters who were not directly seen, but were drawn by proxy according to the description. The slight humor is manifested in a very delicate combination of elements that are either human or animal face or body. When we say delicate, in simplest words, we mean use of very light and muted colors with soft transitions between large abstract surfaces and fragmentations, which were obtained by means of simplification. It never looks like a contrast between the witty is never hilarious, but is calm or mild even. One could almost say kindly ironic. Consequently, the author manages to design his imagined monster with the effect of being cloaked with loving. And this is probably the reason why his pictures are so popular among children. And here we inevitably think of the late Gothic drolleries, because they were the same kind of inverse world. Regarding text, irony functions here as a mild transition from the boring encyclopedic listing, systematization by means of text, again towards imaginative, slightly humorous drawing which illustrates this boredom, and here the element of contrast yet manifests itself. Boredom can be perceived as some kind of an absurd joke. The important feature of any successful joke is sudden encounter of the two worlds, which causes an explosion of laughter. Elimination of that and achievement of the effect of funny by means of the relationship of solely a narrator and listener who expects an explosion and it is not there characterizes absurd jokes. The text transforms gradually from a simple encyclopedic systematization into some sort of utopia. It describes the world of monsters as monsters, place that is nowhere, but could be described to human world, but also into criticism of the man's world. Moreover, it becomes some sort of moralization. The monsters are namely advising us or advising the human world. Namely, in her search for appropriate comparison for Marianovich illustration, Professor Damianov recalled Gothic drolleries. I hope you're most familiar with drolleries. So Gothic drolleries, so the name comes from French word drôle. Drôle meaning funny, or drôlerie meaning a joke. These were grotesque and frequently fantastic late medieval illustrations in manuscripts, which quite precisely describe the existence of Marianovich illustrations, especially those of his monsters. Drolleries are perhaps the best visual example of the already mentioned Huygens antipodal or inverse nature of a possible world inhabited by monstrous beings. The second observation by the reviewer, meaning Professor Damianov, refers to the intonation of the text itself, which perhaps starts as a parody imitation of the encyclopedic form, but then gradually transforms into a form of describing utopia. This confirms exactly the utopian function of the marvelous, which we found earlier in the classification of Jacques Le Goff. Thirdly, Professor Damianov draws our attention to the change of focalization in the text. If Marianovich's narratives before the Encyclopedia of Monsters were performed from the perspective of a superior, namely reliable, and therefore nameless narrator, this work introduces narration from unreliable first perspective of monsters themselves. This enabled Marianovich, similar to the writers like Victor Ivančić in Croatia, who write from infantile position of a child, to take a position that it is at the same time witty and antipodally inverse as well as critical towards our own reality. The Encyclopedia of Monsters is literally flooded with antipodal inversions and witty criticism of the world of man, starting with a fictional narrator, and his name is, well, again, it's very hard to translate this. His name is Knows He How, the Faultless One. Let's see how he does look like. So this is Knows He How, the Faultless One. He is a permanent member of the Great Council of Monsters, and because our author is here today with us, I have to say it's antipodal and monstrous self-portrait of the author. Take a good look at it. Now, antipodal inversions are clearly generically related to critical observations of ourselves. And they can especially be noticed in the chapters that deal with procreation of monsters. Now, we will come to the most interesting parts of encyclopedia, procreation. Yes. Procreations of monsters and their way of life. For example, Marianovich, or Knows He How, the Faultless One, introduces a number of different procreations among monsters, and these can, in totally inverse sense, and yet quite hilariously, refer to our present controversies related to sexual orientation and, of course, gender identity. Well, oh, yes. Don't ask me what is the black spot on the left side. A quote. Now, this is beautiful. Most monsters, I'd say 67% of us, mate and procreate in the way I'm going to describe. This is typical of all monsters whose gender is not decided at birth. This is to say that the usual male and female in humans, most animals and number of plants are not determined from birth when we talk about monsters. When these monsters start to mate, the partners just happen to acquire a definite gender. One of them becomes a female, and the other has no choice but to become a male. About 2 years after giving birth, the mother loses all her female attributes and reverts to the state before mating. In other words, her gender is again ambivalent. The same thing happens to the father, the male. More often than not, the same pair soon wants another little monster and so mates again. But of course, the former mother might now become the father of the original, or the original father turns into, of course, the mother. In some rare and interesting cases, these monsters have twins. In all the cases I've heard of, the twins are equally divided between two parents. That is, there are two mothers, which means both are females. The male is no place around until the next mating, and so on and so forth. In a similar but much more comprehensive and serious manner, Marjanović deals with the problem of the creation of monsters, which was also elaborated at the same point by my own review of the Encyclopedia of Monsters, which was written 15 years ago, but I don't want to bother you with that, although it's written, or it's written here. But we have no time. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, 15 years ago. In the same antipodal spirit, Marjanović inverts the Decalogue of Moses from the Old Testament in the chapter dedicated to the foundations of the great law of monsters and transforms it into the ecological, ethical criticism of our entire existence. With this, our conventional heteronymous perception of ethics based on duties, prohibitions, and commandments, but also teleologically justified supremacy of man over the rest of the living world, is transformed into another kind of ethics, which is based on self-explanatory logic of social and ecological sustainability. Finally, principles of ethics similar to the ones by Marjanović are known also as the so-called indigenous ethics, but built on solidarity among people, as well as care for children and the environment. Regarding ethics, the Encyclopedia of Monsters concisely says the following, quote, "Foundations is a collection of wise sayings which God has nicely formed into a sort of rules. In them, God speaks to each particular monster as well as to all monsters who are seen as a nice and charming big family with a great future. These rules form the basis on which the relationship between the monsters are happily and easily built up, as well as our personal relationship with the world, you humans, and ourselves. So please, I will quote all the foundations. I think they're worth of it. Here they are. Number one, in creating life, I have paid great tribute to you, says the God. Your life is my smile, so be worthy of it. Number two, I, meaning God again, created you as you are and gave you tools to create and develop. Be responsible for yourself, for all that I created and for all that you yourself created. Number three, do not worship me. Look at this. Do not worship me, but learn from me. Know that a hen which does nothing but worship the cock does not sit on eggs and can have no baby chicks. 4, avoid man and hide yourself well from him. If he meets you, he will not recognize you as a brother, but will persecute you until his eyes are open. To go to the same place you are heading, he will take a different path. 5. If you throw even a tiny stone into water, the sound will be heard throughout the world, and it will reach my ears too. 6. A funny one. Procreate. Do not make children just like yourselves. Let them be better. 7. Feel and think. Love, and do not be afraid to be loved in return. 8. Know thyself, house of Vatican. If you cannot live in peace with yourself, overrule yourself in order to live in peace with others and all the bounty I have given you. 9. I have given the world all kinds of fruit. From every fruit you can eat. Oh yes. From every fruit you can eat, plant the seeds. 10. Your place is where your shadow is, but take care that it does not fall on others. 11. Never forget that an ant does not realize that it lives in your house, but you know that you live in his. 12. Know that for the worms, even the greatest lion is only a fool. 13. Do not steal. Ask politely. 14. Never crack nuts with another monster's tail. It hurts. 15. Do not wash your hands all the time, but make sure that they are always clean. And finally, 16, instead of our 10 commandments, there, 16, every parent is your parent and every child is your child. Oh, yes. Antipodal critical intention is retained and in some parts additionally underlined in Marianovich's book, The Encyclopedia of Humans, A Real Monster Breaks His Silence, and also focused on the perspective of monsters, of course. Since our anthropocentric and often Eurocentric worldview functions in terms of hermeneutics primarily as interpreting the world through the prism of our own cognition. This text is extremely interesting because it attempts to inverse this position, starting in introduction, written naturally again by Marianovich. Antipode knows how the faultless one. And knows how the faultless one in this context says the following. Dear human beings, you are burdened by innumerable classifications which are mostly unnecessary and even damaging. You designate yourselves by race, religion, by gender and generation, by class and by origin, by borders and languages, by your wealth or poverty, your looks, and whether you are red or black. We're all cowering on this little crumb of a planet, which will tomorrow be overheated, poisoned, and inhospitable for everyone concerned. It is as if togetherness were not more necessary than ever before. Along the same lines, then, the faultless one talks about the creation of man. And so the monster narrator continues. How man was created? I spent only 4 nights going through the books, and I found about 125 answers to that question. Most of these answers are built into the religious explanations of the world. Right there, some claim that you were created by men like gods and goddesses, preoccupied with their squabbles, parties, and flirts. Others claim that some powerful beast, inspired by mysterious forces, or a personified natural force, gave birth to you. And the third group thinks that a single God created you, and that you were created in his image. Fewer answers concerning your creation consist of incomplete scientific and pseudo-scientific explanations, prepared or manipulated in order to become part of some special ideological system of belief. Scientific explanations account for an even smaller part of the answers. They are dry and dust and not covered by large ideological umbrellas. They claim that you are the product of nature and that you are like monkeys. They openly admit their imperfections. They promise that in the future they will be more accurate and more complete, and they openly state that there are never going to be final and definite answers. After such a simplified, but certainly not incorrect interpretation of how we see our own creation, and restating the thesis from the Encyclopedia of Monsters, that a man is perfected monster by God, created by God, Marjanović introduces us to the final antipodal inversion of man's physical description. This description is clearly a product of hermeneutically exchanged position of the describer. This monster, meaning a man, lives on solid ground, not in the water. It is a single axis, symmetrical, and looks like a banana or potato. It is erect in structure, large but also puny, and does not have wings, tails, horns, thorns, or claws. It has just one. Oh, can you imagine? We have just one small head. From the perspective of monsters, it's negative. One small head, 2 hands, 2 feet, and 5 fingers. It is born a male or female. It's small toothed. Its fur is rudimental, with just some remains on a few incredibly stupid places. Its ears are underdeveloped. They're underdeveloped. And its nose is small. It has no third eye, unfortunately, behind the head. It is completely colorless. It has an extremely unpleasant and unnatural smell, and no special qualities whatsoever. Even more destructive is criticism with cultural connotations related to man's perception of female physical beauty. Oh yes, the female. Sorry for what's coming. It actually contains equally simplified survey of female identities, partly recorded by art history and partly by our cultural memory. In this context, Marjanović lists the following options chronologically. A prehistoric beauty, modeled after the Paleolithic Venus, of course. An African beauty. By the way, I've got that one. Sorry. On the left side, the African beauty. So the African beauty with steropygian fats on the buttocks, and there is unearthly beauty of the European Middle Age, embellished with a chastity belt, followed by 2 Oriental types of beauties, among them one from the Near East is covered from head to toe. And finally, we have a hypersexualized woman beast. And finally, on the right side, a very, very interesting right now, and Marjanovic is calling this androgynous woman unwomanly woman. Unwomanly woman. Yes. With equal critical connotations, Marjanovic actually deals with numerous aspects of human existence to the ending of the text, in the way a monster can perceive them, of course. So one could find there the structure of human body, the breathing of the human, the way humans eat, some mostly negative traits of human character, the problem of human search for happiness, search for money, and perception of the state, and blah, blah, blah. Now, when referring to the visual aspects of illustrations signed by Stanislav Marjanovic, we should start once again with observations made by Jadran Kadamian. According to him, the largest portion of his opus can be placed in the rich tradition of late medieval Europe, or to be more precise, the drolleries, already mentioned. Of course, we will gladly recall illuminated manuscripts in the same context, like the lateral saliter. Now, these are some examples of lateral, or in some cases, lateral, as it's pronounced, saliter from the late Middle Ages. Most often in the margins of the manuscripts, depicts fantastical and grotesque combinations of humans and animals. On the other hand, it is difficult not to notice in this illustration a multitude of connotations related, for example, to Albrecht Dürer and his four. Now, Albrecht Dürer and his four books on human proportions created between 1532 and 1534, which is especially obvious in Marjanovic's book, The Encyclopedia of Human. One could find other possible influences as well, in particular, the English fantastical illustrations in the literature for children of the 19th century, German expressionist illustration, or figurative surrealist painting. Still, it has to be said that all these reminiscences belong to the conventional visual literature and do not require special attention. It is far more interesting to focus on the development of the Marjanovic illustration, which is probably most visible in treatment of figures. If we use for this purpose the famous analytical tool in the form of the pyramid with three edges promoted, famous pyramid promoted by Scott McCloud, we can establish that early illustrations by Marjanovic mostly place themselves at the bottom of the pyramid. In other words, they use visual means explicitly for the purpose of descriptive readability, since they were intended for children. Also, the characters were simplified and caricatured by means of cartooning. That's the term that McCloud was using. This situation changes to a certain extent, although predictably, with the book of the Encyclopedia of Monsters, and especially with Encyclopedia of Humans, due to, in the words by Jadran Kadamian, of the hybrid character of these works. Description has remained a permanent feature of illustration by Marjanovic, but the elements of form, and especially the watercolor nature of this opus, are increasingly prominent and begin to act in their own right. So especially on the left example on the left, you can see how the watercolors are starting to live a very separate life compared to what they were supposed to depict. When talking about iconography in Marjanovic's illustration, we do not have narrow understanding of iconography in this case as a sum of visual presentations and symbols with conventionally established meanings. We rather think of the manner in which depictions are formed, In other words, the manner in which phenomena or we find they are presented and which are necessary for our understanding of narration. Indeed, is this the case of reduced illustrative image or the image rich in narrative details? In this context, we will adapt the classical iconographical methods to our purpose and establish a hypothesis related to the existence of 4 possible ways of presentation: symbolic, reduced, narrative, and simulated presentations. Now, I have to make all this a little bit shorter, so I will just show you. So this is reduced presentation, which is reduced only to a specific character without further attributes, except for the most necessary ones. On this case, we have so-called narrative presentation. And finally, in a few narrative presentation, and in the few examples, we have a simulation, and the simulation is, of course, a simulated world which is known to us. So, finally, I will skip the conclusion too because I'm already late. It has to be finally established that it is not that Stanislav Marjanović is not a canonical narrator, and his texts, for the most part, intended for younger audience, as well as others with interest, are rarely based on canonical strategies. In this context, exceptions are represented only by titles: The Book of Magic Formulas and The Lost Slippers. These can be analyzed using traditional analytic tools like Freytag's pyramids. On the other hand, illustrations by Marjanović relate to the text literally or analogically, in most cases remaining persistent in their inclinations towards readability. And this will be the end of this presentation because we are already very late. And we are very. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. You've been extremely patient, audience.
What you had to say, and I think I would agree that really interesting and inspiring presentation, and we know much more about Marjanović's work, which is really, it really deserves. So, although we plan the lunch in the next section, we have enough time. So maybe we would just allow for a question or two. If you have any questions.
No, we need coffee.
Okay, so much information and a very deep analysis, but maybe I would have just a short question. Okay, so yeah, actually, I want to ask you both. Yes, but this is a question that you can answer from the point of view of interpreters. So, as far as I understand, your first illustrations for of monsters were meant for your books. So, what happened that these monsters were guided you towards such a wide representation of world which is relevant for every reader?
Dakle, prva čudovišta, nastavak moje čeri, ja bilo tako da sam ja s ovim ličnim knjigama o čudovištima zapravo na jedan određeni način prati uzrast moje djece.
So the first story is really when my children, when they were very small, and then they grew, and my stories also grew with them. I followed their growth with my stories.
They became monsters, bigger monsters. And we know how it happens and how it ends.
What if you think?
But they don't that koji je relevantan za svaki čip. Znači, kad krenemo u enciklopediju čovjeka, onda tu nalazimo jedan vrlo sofisticirani pogled na svijet, jednu kombinaciju vašeg i umjetničkog i autorskog zapravo svjetonazora. Znači, sad to više nije samo za djecu, sad je to za svakog. To vas je pogled.
Da, je moja djeca, nisu uvijek postala djeca. Kad su rasla, dolazi do terena umjetno ženi, se govori na 5 godina, ali kako se imaju, recimo, podijeli do enciklopedije čudovišta. I na koncu enciklopedije čovjeka je rađena, isto tako, jel? Pristup čovjeka, već bilo praktično turbeljeva. Dakle, kako su se teme koje su se pojavljivale u određenom periodu života te teme šire.
Yes, well, they continue to be connected with my children because as they grew into teenagers and then adults, the topics we addressed in our communications grew, and so my daughters grew with them. Right. And do you still have that in mind when you decide to make a new book about monsters? Jer još uvijek mislite upravo na njih kad pišete